Hi, and welcome to the Lowdown with me, Nick Cohen. We're witnessing, I believe, deeply alarming developments in British politics. Deeply alarming because some people, most people maybe, in the political class haven't quite got their heads around them yet. And the alarming development, the ominous development, is that Nigel Farage, who's ahead in the polls, who, if there were election tomorrow, could possibly form the next government, who knows? Given our country's bad luck, could well happen. He is quite clearly moving off to the extremes now, to my mind, anyway. But this thought, this understanding of where Farage and where the British right is heading, has not really embedded itself into the media and into the political class. Let me explain why I'm saying what I'm saying. Throughout his career, Farage has always drawn a distinction between him and his supporters and the extreme right. In the 2010s, he broke with UKIP, the UK Independence Party, which he helped turn into a major force, helped drive Britain out of the EU, because it was flirting with Tommy Robinson and football thuggery and neo-fascism. He wouldn't have it. He just walked away. As late as June this year, Dominic Cummings, who really hasn't aged well, let me tell you that. Dominic Cummings was at a meeting in Oxford of very right-wing people, and Cummings was mocking Farage as yesterday's man, a man of the 1990s, a man who was formed around the turn of the millennium and didn't understand the need, as Cummings said, for mass deportation, for a really full-blooded, really extreme right-wing program. Well, he does now, ladies and gentlemen, like hell he does. He's now proposing abolishing indefinite leave to remain. That's the status that all kinds of people who weren't born in Britain have in Britain, that gives them legal right to be here. Hundreds of thousands, millions of EU migrants, people's husbands, people's wives, people's workers, people's colleagues, all their status being thrown up in the air. It's quite clear to me that he's being influenced by Trump. We'll get to that in a minute. One way in which the malign Trumpian influence is being seen and is being demonstrated is his sudden embrace of absolute quackery, of the most ludicrously insulting and dangerous superstitious pseudoscience. So the Reform is Farage's party. We should really just call it the Farage party, because that's what it is. At the Reform conference a few weeks ago, some quack appeared claiming that COVID vaccines gave the King and the Princess of Wales cancer. They really didn't. Now, when Trump says paracetamol causes autism, something which is absolutely disgusting thing to say to every parent of an autistic child, Farage won't condemn it. He won't agree with it, but he says he wants to debate. He plays all the usual smarmy tricks. And I find this alarming. I find it alarming that we are not calling. Here's one thing that really gets me about Farage, about all these people. They keep saying, "Oh, we use the English language plainly. We call a spade a spade. We're not these pseudo intellectuals with their liberal progressive jargon." But more than any other politician of my lifetime, Farage is benefiting from people biting their tongues, keeping their heads down, not calling a spade, not using the English language plainly, and saying what he really is. To discuss this, and I hope he will use the English language plainly, we're joined by Ed Hodgson from the think tank More in Common. It's an extraordinary and very interesting group of people who recognise the divisions in British society, don't try and paper them up, try and find common values, and of course, in their work, have to think about extremism really quite a lot, more than is probably good for them. Ed, welcome to the Lowdown.
Hello, thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. Did you agree with my intro? Did you agree with my argument that Farage is quite decisively shifting gear and shifting direction?
Yeah, look, I think if you zoom back and think towards the start of the year when Reform were not doing as well in the polls now, they were sort of closer to 20%, and obviously they got 15% in the election last year. They were sort of almost scoring sort of home run after home run. They were performing very well in terms of policy announcements that were popular, sounding like they were sort of more on track with the concerns that people have. And I think they did a very good job at sort of tapping into the very anti-establishment sort of pro-change public mood that is very pervasive at the moment. And then that paid off very well in the local elections, and of course they did extremely well, took on a number of councils that people thought that they had no chance of taking really, and really sort of converted some of those polling numbers into electoral results in quite sort of substantial ways. But like you say now, it seems like they haven't quite made the shift from a party supported by 15% of the country to a party supported by 30%. And what I mean by that is, as they've grown, they've doubled their voter base since the election. Their voters have come to look a lot more normal. So people, if you talk to people who say they're going to vote Reform now, their attitudes on a range of issues, from say immigration to the NHS to the cost of living, are much more normal and much more in line with the median British voter than they were even at the last election, when Reform were a much smaller fringe. The issue there is that as their sort of leaders, and particularly Nigel Farage, like you say, sort of keep appealing to their base, they risk alienating some of those new voters who've come to them since the election. And like you say, I think some of the biggest examples of that are, one, on vaccines and healthcare, and two, on Donald Trump.
Yeah. Do you? This is always. I'm not having a go at you, Ed. I'm just being a miserablest pessimist, which is my nature, really. I'm sorry, but it didn't hurt Trump. The
Mhm.
conventional argument in politics is always, yeah, yeah, yeah. You pander to your base, so if you're a Labour politician, you appear more left wing than you really are to get the leadership. Arguably, Andy Burnham's doing that at the moment. But as soon as you get control of your party, you then pivot to the center. Pivot. It used to be a cliche among American political journalists until Trump came along. You pivot to the center, and people are saying, well, Farage ought to be appealing more to the center because more of his voters are normal people rather than
Mhm.
fanatics. But it didn't stop Donald Trump, did it? I mean, Donald Trump hasn't gone to the center. And he's still sitting in the White House. He's not some loser licking his wounds at the top of some ghastly hotel in New York.
Yeah, I think I think what you say is definitely true, and it definitely used to be the case that there was more to gain in that sort of pivot to the center. Now, when it's really an attention war more than anything else, it kind of makes sense if you're, particularly if you're a third party, an insurgent party, to say the attention grabbing thing to get the headlines so that you can be covered and sort of remind people who you are. Like if you think about where the Conservatives are right now, they've not been saying as much stuff as as Reform have, and they've basically, if you talk to people at focus groups, they say they've not heard anything from the Conservative Party. So that strategy, in terms of on the attention war, makes sense. The issue is, if too much of the stuff they're saying just seems weird to people, or seems sort of out of touch with what they'd want from a normal party. So if you, when we've polled and spoken to the people who aren't currently, if there was an election today, they wouldn't vote Reform, but they would consider voting Reform, i.e., kind of reforms like these are the people Reform should be targeting if they want to win more votes. If you ask them what's holding them back from voting Reform, there's two issues at the top. One is that Reform have no experience in government. The solution to that is looking more credible. I actually think the conference a few weeks ago was sort of a positive step for them, at least, in looking a bit more professional and credible, and that it was very slickly produced and looked like a normal party conference. But the other big barrier for people is that Farage is too close to Trump. The potential Reform voters and a lot of Reform's newer voters really don't like Donald Trump. In fact, if you look at the start of the year, Reform voters were the only group in the UK with a positive approval rating of Donald Trump. Now, throughout the year, that's fallen and fallen, and now Reform voters are much more likely to not like Trump than like him. And I think trying to associate sort of Farageness with like too much Trumpian politics, I think will be really off-putting to some of those newer voters.
I noticed Ed Davey was doing that last week, over the past few days. Ed Davey,
Mhm.
Farage, Trump. We don't want Trump in Britain. He'll make us turn us into a Trumpian nation.
Yeah, that's an interesting line, isn't it? I think for Ed Davey, it's a slightly different approach because realistically, I'm not sure he's winning too many potential Reform voters over. I don't think that's his strategy. But he wants to be able to set out a position which is somewhat distinct from Labour, while I guess leaving the door open to doing a coalition with Labour if needs be at the next election.
Do you think? I mean, it's a very interesting argument. I'm quite centrist, and I've always thought, and I think now in America in particular, you've got to run what used to be called an anti-fascist strategy. It is now called, I noticed Morgan McSweeney calls it the Republican front after what the centre and the left do in France to stop Le Pen. That is, you build the widest possible coalition. And that means if you're left wing, you have to give up a hell of a lot. You've got to bring over the moderates on the right to your camp to stop the greater danger, the greater evil of an extreme right winger taking power. So in that case, you say, well, you've got to start wooing reform voters. But are they wooable? Is this a realistic way to think about stopping Farage?
Yeah, I think you've got to think about sort of reform voters in a few ways. Like, I think there's lots of reform voters who are really, really not winnable by Labour. In fact, they hate Labour. They've never voted Labour, and there's no way in hell they would be voting for Labour in the next election. Those, I mean, this is quite crude, but you can think of them as the 15% of the country who voted for reform last year. Those are not winnable, and it would be mistaken for Labour's priority to be trying to win back those 15%. But there's another 15% of the country who've gone to reform since the election last year, and that group are definitely winnable. Like, many of them have voted Labour before. They have many more sort of sympathies towards that style of politics. They've left the Labour Party often because of they don't think that Keir Starmer is sort of rising to the challenge on immigration in particular, or because they think they haven't sort of represented the change they wanted, and they haven't seen. If you think people voted, really, the first word of Labour's manifesto all over the front of it was change. And then Labour came in, we had the freebie scandal, we had winter fuel allowance, we've now had Angela Rayner. People see the new government as kind of more of the same chaos that we had
Mm.
before. So if they can somehow restore that, I guess, brand issue and show that they are meaningfully different, I think they could win some of those reform voters back. I would say that reform base, the interesting thing about them is they tend not to vote in elections, actually. They will vote if they get a big chance to change things. So if Labour's best hope for some of them might be that, not that they come out and vote for Labour, but they think that Labour's doing well enough that they just decide sort of not to vote and sit out that election.
Can I come back to the Labour Party in a moment? Let's just hold that. I wanted to ask about ethnic minorities in Britain, or migrant communities and the kids of migrants. Are one of the complaints about the polling industry over the years has been it's not the industry's fault, it's the people who commission polls, but there is very little polling evidence on what Black Britons, Asian Britons, I don't know, EU citizens in Britain's
Mhm.
diverse population thinks. I was wondering, they've gone from a world where people like Rishi Sunak and Kemi Badenoch could be leaders of the Conservative Party. What an extraordinary thing for multi-ethnic Britain, the Conservative Party at all parties. So that was last year. In rapid succession now, you've had the Conservatives replaced by Reform. You've had a weird thing with, I'm not saying it's threatening, I'm not saying it's our flag, we claim flag, but it was kind of weird over the summer. Streets, flags, English flags just appearing everywhere. And now you've got Reform suddenly veering off to the right. I mean, with this proposal to deport people, to remove the legal status, the peace of mind of hundreds of thousands, millions of people in Britain who thought this was just settled. We've got indefinite leave to remain. We've got it here. I noticed when I was researching for this interview, Madeline Sumption, director of the Migration Observatory at Oxford, saying no government in the West has tried anything like this, not even Trump's America. So, is there any evidence that people from minorities, in minority communities, or people who've married someone, whose girlfriend, whose boyfriend, whose workers are starting to get a bit, what the hell's going on in this country? They're starting to get a bit fearful, starting to get a bit worried.
Yeah, that's a good question. I share the same frustrations about the lack of really good polling of people from ethnic minority groups. So we sort of have to chase after like what little polling there is on questions like this. Um, I do think some of the shift in rhetoric has gone, particularly from some leaders in reform, has gone further than where the public are. It's worth saying the public are much more frustrated about immigration than they have been at any point in the last 10 years, really. And demand for stronger immigration policies has sort of never been so high. And a lot of reform policies have been popular. So I think some of the deportation stuff on sending back foreign criminals, for example, uh, is popular. The stuff on sending women back to Afghanistan does not land that well with the public. and indefinite leave to remain, I think you might start seeing more and more people look at that and go, hang on, I know quite a lot of people here on indefinite leave to
Mm,
remain. They've been here for however many years, and it's bizarre that we would send them back home because it doesn't make sense for them to go anywhere else. So I think sort of just from a mainstream, sort of wider British public perspective, I think that it's definitely true that some of the policies being proposed have shifted a bit further beyond where the public demand is. In terms of what ethnic minorities themselves think, we track a question on sort of how safe do you think Britain is for, I think we asked British Muslims and people from ethnic minorities. And that the feelings of unsafety really spiked in the riots last summer, but
mm.
it's never fallen down to the levels it was before. Quite a big chunk of the country say that Britain is now unsafe, for example, for British Muslims, which is worrying. And when we speak to people in focus groups, people often tell us that sort of increasingly that they're a bit worried by some of this stuff. I would say that's not always the case, and actually, there's a lot of people from ethnic minorities, often sort of second and third generation immigrants, who themselves then become pretty sort of anti more immigration, and I think those sort of second and third generation immigrants, often in focus groups, can be just as opposed to new immigration as
Yeah.
immigrants because they share a lot of the same concerns about things like pressure on public services.
It wasn't so much migration, it was the question of safety. I mean, I do think the riots were a pivotal event because I would never have predicted this happened. You have the right, and I don't just mean Farage and Tommy Robinson. You have Kemi Badenoch, the Daily Telegraph. Their main reaction to having mobs on the streets who are that far away, who are inches away from the police lines breaking and burning asylum seekers alive in hotels and burning Muslims alive who were worshipping in Southport mosques, is, oh no, we are all going to rush to the defence of Lucy Connolly, who was actually had just been tweeting, set their mosques on fire, burn them alive for all I care, call me a racist, I don't care anymore. And
Mhm.
and and that was their reaction. And I do wonder if if they if they in turn are not playing with fire on that, if there's any evidence at all of a kind of backlash against the levels of dangerous rhetoric coming out from, well, everyone from the Tory party rightwards, really.
Yeah, like the idea of sort of political violence and violence against asylum hotels. I guess the reassuring thing that we see in the data is we track people. Do you think it's acceptable to sort of commit violence outside asylum hotels and do violent protest? The numbers who say it is acceptable are very small, about 7 or 8%. Those numbers have not risen in the last few years. So even as sort of rhetoric that seems to suggest it's more acceptable has risen across the public, that's not really caught on, and the majority of people still think that's really unacceptable. The challenge is does that rhetoric that we see more and more from political leaders in the press, does that embolden that very small number of people who think political violence outside asylum hotels, sort of threatening asylum seekers, is acceptable? Does it embolden them, even though they're a small group? Might they sort of become more confident? It's hard to know for sure, but I think it's definitely possible. The good news though is that it doesn't seem from the data that sort of support for those protests more broadly is spreading.
You are listening to The Lowdown with me, Nick Cohen. Our guest is Ed Hodgson from the More in Common think tank, and he's trying to dissect attitudes towards right-wing politics and extreme right-wing politics in Britain today. Ed, can we turn to the Labour Party? Because if you'd asked me, or quite a lot of people, you said, well, look, God put the Labour Party on earth for one purpose, frankly. Well, there are lots of purposes, but one purpose is you've got to be able to fight people like Farage, and you've got to be able to beat them. And it seems to me that they're not fighting Farage, and they're certainly not beating them. What is the Labour's? Does Labour have a problem? Is it a problem of Starmer's leadership? Is it a problem of personality, or is it a problem that public attitudes have so shifted that they're no longer getting a hearing?
Yeah, I think it's really tough. I think it's probably a mix of all three. Um, I think I mentioned earlier sort of Labour's rocky start in government with the freebies, with winter fuel allowance, and I think those first few months really didn't help them. I also think their first few months of coming in and immediately going on about things will get worse before they get better. We've got this massive black hole. we can't change everything at once, was just not what people wanted and a complete misreading of the room. It's true at the time, the public mood was very gloomy and not optimistic about a new government being able to fix things. But I think the response they wanted from the government was not a new government coming in and saying, yes, things are gloomy, we're not going to be able to fix things. They wanted a new government coming in and doing, honestly, a bit more like of what Trump's rhetoric is like, which is things are great and we've got solutions and we're going to get going. They wanted to see some of that optimism. And when they didn't see it, it just made them depressed and made them think, oh, we've just voted in this new government and it's going to be no different to the last one. I think that sort of left a lot of space for Nigel Farage to come in, and he could then sort of using sort of the fact that he was a third party almost gave him a bit more wiggle room to sort of just be critiquing from the outside and be putting forward some slightly more outlandish proposals to show people like basically here's the significant stuff we can propose that sort of meets the demands that you want.
I was listening to the guy who the New Statesman hired to sort of do your job to collect data and analyze polls, and he said the only thing people can remember from the first year of the Labour government by a mile is cutting winter fuel allowance, which is not great, really. If you come in under change, here's the change we're bringing, and that's all people can remember for you. If the shadow cabinet was if the actual cabinet, not the shadow cabinet, the actual cabinet was to call you in. So we're having a meeting.
Mm-hmm.
We're not having Keir for reasons you will soon understand, Ed, when you get here. But if we're calling you in and we want to look at the data, Keir's popularity is now as low as Boris Johnson's, which is incredible, as Boris Johnson was such a disaster and such a hypocrite and did such damage to this country. And the cabinet just said, look, can any leader recover from unpopularity as deep as Starmer has got? Or should we get another one?
Yeah, it's so tough, isn't it? There's not many examples in the historic polling record of a leader going from such negative lows to such positive highs. Although that said, like the polling record, it's only a recent thing that we've had such unpopular leaders in the UK. If you take the long view and look at prime minister approvals over time, they've just been steadily declining over the last decade as people, I guess it's a change of A, who our prime ministers have been, and B, sort of what people expect from our prime ministers. That said, I think it's possible that there's things that Starmer could do that even if his own personal approval doesn't improve, if he starts to make people feel a bit better about the government as a whole, it's possible that's enough to sort of help them win the next election or at least sort of become the largest party. So I'm not one of those people who think it's game over for Labour. If they do nothing, if they don't change leader, they're on track to lose the next election. In terms of who they would change their leader to, that's a bigger challenge. So there's been lots of talk this week about Andy Burnham, as you will have seen. Andy Burnham is the only popular Labour politician in our polling and in lots of polling. And actually, when we polled the hypothetical question, how would you vote if Andy Burnham was leader of the Labour Party? The Labour Party actually is beating Reform in the opinion polls, which is quite substantial. So if you're a Labour backbencher, you can see why that's quite a promising thought.
Yeah, yeah.
The issue is, I think that hypothetical polling, well, okay, there's the practical issue of Andy Burnham's not an MP, so there's all those steps to get there. Fine. From a polling perspective, hypothetical polling is hypothetical polling. People can say they would vote Labour if Andy Burnham became Labour leader, but the truth is, if they see Labour changing their leader again, it might just reinforce their sense that this party is chaotic and sort of not up for the job, and they'll start to look maybe a bit more like the Tories when they were just changing leader quite often. I think if I was Andy Burnham, there's no way I would be making moves this early on in the Parliament. There's a lot more to go. I think the local elections will be really bad for Labour next year. And you can see after those local elections, I imagine there'll be much more mounting pressure on Keir Starmer to go. The nice thing about Andy Burnham from a public opinion perspective, he's not been in government for the last few years, so he can sort of come in as a fresh, clean slate in the way that actually Nigel Farage can do pretty well too. But given that if you were Andy Burnham, you wouldn't want to be coming in too soon because you don't necessarily want to be associated with that.
No, these are all good points. Can I go back to well, here are one line of attack Labour could use, and Ed Davey, God bless him, is using on Farage is you're tied to Trump. And people don't like Trump. But there is what is weird about Britain, or not weird, that's the wrong word. What is noticeable about right and left, the political nation is becoming ever more Americanized. Someone on Twitter made the wonderful point that the British right says it's patriotic, but it's becoming so American, it's not British. So, a right-wing influencer is assassinated in America, Reform, and there are people at Reform and the Telegraph, absolutely heartbroken because they follow Kirk, they follow America online. They go to if they're big shots, they go to the big right-wing conferences in America. But America is part of their world, and you can see that with Liz Truss. Uh, you can see that with Kemi Badenoch, and you can see it with Farage. They're making a mistake in your view. They're confusing. They're cutting themselves off from their own country.
Yeah, I think Britain's relationship with America is interesting. I think obviously there's lots of ideals that people do like about America, but when most Britons sort of look at what's going on in America at all, they're not positive about the changes that Donald Trump has brought. They're worried about even things like freedom of speech in America right now, which was not a worry for people beforehand. We did some polling actually earlier on this year where we polled in a range of countries, sort of Western democracies, who are your allies, who would you see are your allies and who would you see are your enemies. The interesting thing there is the number of people who say America is an ally in Britain has fallen to less than half, even though in
Right.
America, more than 80% of Americans think that Britain is an ally. So there's this weird sort of one-way relationship going on, at least in a public opinion perspective, where Americans still feel very close to Britain, and Britons in many ways do feel quite close to America, but that's definitely falling quite quickly.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I wonder if one obvious line of attack for Labour is to do what Davy's doing, and
Mm.
to tie Farage to Trump, and maybe to Putin as well. But actually tie him to this. But of course, Labour say they can't do that because Keir Starmer's got to keep good relations with Trump. Although that doesn't stop Trump's America interfering in British politics all the time. Starmer says, I've got to have clean hands. I can't possibly criticise Trump because he's our ally. JD Vance comes over to Britain and he's bigging up Nigel Farage every which way. Elon Musk is beamed into London and is urging violence on the streets. It does seem to be all one-way traffic as far as the
Mhm.
Labour Party is concerned. But they could do that, but they won't. Could they? You're probably going to break the hearts of all my centrist dad listeners here, Ed. But could Labour as well, should Labour as well, turn round and say to the public, listen, this guy Farage, the last time the public listened to Nigel Farage, he took us out of the EU, and that was a disaster. Why on earth are we giving this clown airtime, space in our heads again? Just ignore him. He's a massive failure, and he proved that with Brexit.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one because
Oh no!
we we hear that in focus groups from people who voted Brexit. Like it's not a one of the most common. If you ask people at Farage in focus groups, you'll either get people who quite like him and they'll say he's more honest than other politicians and he just seems like he understands people's concerns more, or you get people who say, why would I trust Farage? He took us out of the EU. He lied to us over Brexit. Those things. And it's even sort of quite Brexity types who will say that often. They'll feel really let down and disappointed by Nigel Farage. So sort of in the abstract, that argument works well, and I think there are people who could make that argument well. I would worry about Keir Starmer making that argument because Keir Starmer, of course, was sort of is associated by lots of people in that scene as sort of part of the Remain crowd, and you don't want him to look like he's sort of relitigating Brexit and telling those people sort of that they were wrong to vote Brexit because they listened to Nigel Farage. So he's a difficult messenger for that message, if that makes sense. There's maybe people in Labour's benches who could make that argument, but I think if you're Keir Starmer, you don't want to be seen necessarily to be sort of challenging the premises of
But,
Brexit.
but, but hold on, Ed. If it's the case that people, including people who voted Brexit,
Yeah,
think it was a mistake, think they were conned by Nigel
yeah.
Farage, Why can't people who will remain say that? What's wrong with them doing that? Well, you look at the polls on whatever it is. 60% of people now would now vote to re-enter the EU. I mean, once it starts getting to 66%, two-thirds of the country, I think we're in a game on. But why can't what's wrong with saying I'm a Remainer?
Mhm.
Uh, I think we should have stayed in the EU. You seem to think that now. You certainly think you were conned. I'm going to call out the guy who conned you. What's wrong with Starmer doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would make sense. It would like have more logical consistency if then Starmer was going to call for something like a re-entry to the EU, which
Well, yeah.
he's not doing. I think doing it now and then saying, but we're going for Brexit anyway, it just comes across as a little, it's a bit, it doesn't quite add up, I think, to people, and they'll think that is he not just sort of continuing the con, or is he, do you see what I mean? It's
Yeah.
sort of a half-measured way of doing
Because
it.
the next question is, okay, Keir, thanks so much. Yeah, Starmer's a charlatan. We know that. But
Yeah.
what are you going to do? Stay with the disastrous settlement you say he's imposed on this country.
Yeah, exactly. And Farage can do, and he does do quite effectively the, oh, it was such a mistake for me to step out of politics after Brexit. This is why I'm coming in to fix it all up.
Dear God. Dear God. I mean, do you think? I mean, this is not a question. Maybe there is polling evidence. I
Mm,
mean, my reading of the situation is he's getting a Messiah complex. He's certainly getting a Trump complex because
hmm
what the terrible lesson Trump has taught politicians is you can lie, you can tell huge lies. I mean, absolutely massive lies about winning an election you lost and get away with it. Your supporters can storm Congress and attempt a coup, and you can get away with it. You can appoint some mad sprig of the Kennedy family as your health secretary, coming out with all kinds of drivel about vaccines and autism, and get away with it. And maybe that's a lesson Farage is taking. That's why Farage is no longer trying to draw a line in the sand, a border between him and the far right.
Yeah, I think the thing he's noticed, which is true, is that our current government and the previous Tory government are so unpopular with the public that people who generally would not support reform or like Farage are willing to sort of roll the dice and say, well, it can't get any worse. We might as well try something a bit different. And in that space, reform can sort of say a bit of what they like. They just need to get attention and remind people that they're there. In which case, given that there's such a sort of an anti-incumbent mood, reform has a lot more wiggle room in terms of what they can and can't say than a party normally can say. That said, I don't think they can push it too far. I think it's definitely true that in recent weeks, the swans in the park or some of the Tylenol stuff that Farage has been saying, I think that will sort of freak people out. It might not be enough to sort of make people go and vote for Labour or the Conservatives again, but it might make them sort of sit out an election and withhold their vote for reform. One final thing I would say, which is interesting, is I was talking to someone the other day, and he was saying he reckons that reform might have peaked in the polls, and like this week might be a sign that reform are peaking. The thing with that is like I think reform would be quite happy if they were peaking. They're on 30% of the polls right now, which doesn't feel like that much, but in our super fragmented system, that is easily enough to get them quite a significant majority and push Labour and Conservatives quite far behind. So if Reformer have decided, you know what, we're going to solidify 30% in the polls and try and freeze that position, that net wouldn't necessarily be a bad move for them, given that weirdly enough in our electoral system, 30% is enough to get quite a big majority.
You are listening to The Lowdown with me, Nick Cohen. My guest is Ed Hodgson from the More Uncommon think tank, trying to dissect for us the currents moving the right and the far right. Finally, Ed, let's turn to the old right. Let's turn to the Conservative Party, the most successful party in the world, as it used to boast. It can trace its origins back to the English Civil War of the 1640s. Now, just screwed, isn't it? I mean, it looks totally screwed.
It's really tough to see a clear path to recovery for the Conservatives. The main thing we see, so when we talk to people about it, is they just haven't heard from the Conservatives in the last few years, and a few months. And I think if you look back to after the election, Kemi Badenoch when she was elected leader of the Conservatives, she probably thought she could do what would be a relatively standard thing as a new leader of the opposition to do, which is sort of be quiet for a bit, think about your policies, think about your strategy and direction for the next few years, and then when we get close to an election, start being a bit more vocal and introduce yourself to the public. The issue is that works very well in a two-party system. It does not work in what we have now, which is a multi-party system, because if
Yeah.
Badenoch's quiet, Nigel Farage will fill the void, and he has. So that's been a very sort of difficult start for the Conservative Party. Kemi Badenoch's an interesting one because while people haven't heard from her, when we show people clips of her in focus groups, they are willing to listen and they do quite often quite like what she has to say. They find her quite refreshing and different and interesting. But whether being interesting is enough is a different matter. In terms of where the Conservatives go, there's just so many roadblocks for them. You've got Reform obviously taking a lot of seats from them, and you'd expect Reform to sort of do very good, um, have a very good showing in the seats held by a lot of even sort of Tory shadow cabinet members in the next election. You also have the Liberal Democrats, who are now on 72 seats, which is the most they've ever been on. I sort of think of the Liberal Democrats for the Conservatives in the same way that we used to think about the SNP for Labour. So before the election last year, the SNP had such a hold over Scotland that the SNP were really a big roadblock for Labour forming a decent majority in Parliament. In the election last year, Labour were able to sort of make quite good inroads against the SNP. But now we have for the Tories that those Liberal Democrats sort of sitting across the blue rule, and particularly in the southwest of the country, in all these quite conservative traditional seats.
Mm.
Those Liberal Democrats present a real challenge for the Conservatives because even if they win back all these seats from Reform, they have these 70 seats that really could be and in many ways should be Conservative seats, present real challenges. And the other challenge for the Conservatives is that it's increasingly hard to go after both the Liberal Democrats and the Reform because the Liberal Democrats, like you said, have sort of defined themselves in opposition to Farage. Ed Davey's main thing has been sort of not being Farage, going quite hard on Farage when other party leaders aren't. If the Conservatives want to sort of win some of those voters back, they're going to sort of alienate the voters in the more reformy seats that they have. So the Conservatives have a very difficult situation on their hands.
Yeah, it's been a kind of a repeated theme of this podcast since the election, really, of how little attention is paid to the Lib Dems,
Mm-hmm.
how by media, by politicians, because it's incredible what they've done.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for right-wing media that they don't like the fact that they have to start looking at faults. They have to start looking at their own faults and having to start saying maybe we're too right-wing. Maybe to get those seats back, we need to be more liberal. They hate saying that because it removes their righteous anger and their virtuous defiance. But it is the most extraordinary thing, and I quite agree. If you lose Tunbridge Wells as a Conservative Party, you're in so much trouble. You're possibly in terminal trouble.
Yeah, I would share that view. I mean, I think if I was a Conservative Party, I think the one thing they can do is really just focus on the economy. So for Farage and Reform are easily winning among voters who care a lot about immigration. They're easily seen as more credible on immigration, and it's hard for the Conservatives to make a case that sort of one-ups Reform, given the direction that Reform are going. Um, so I think trying to compete with Reform on immigration, obviously they need policies on immigration, but trying to compete and outflank them is not going to win them the voters that they want to be winning. It will, because the voters who are most concerned about immigration are the sort of hardcore Reform voters who also hate the Conservatives and have never voted Conservative. So it makes no sense from my perspective for the Conservatives to be trying to outflank Reform on immigration. If I was a Conservative, I would be going big on the economy because that's still the Conservative strong point. It's still where people trust the Conservatives more than they trust Reform and Labour. And it's the one thing that sort of, if you think about the three big issues, and we track sort of big issues of the public, it's either public services, immigration, or the economy. Labour's winning on public services, Reform's winning on immigration. It just makes sense for the Conservatives in many ways to talk about the economy, although I'm sure you would rightly point out that public sort of satisfaction with the Conservatives' handling of the economy is not particularly high.
Also, I try to remember the last time when the Conservative Party made sense. And so they're saying it makes sense to talk about the economy. That's going to get you absolutely nowhere with the current Conservative leadership. I would say to that. Finally, Ed, one last question, very
Yeah.
briefly. Again and again, we have people on here whose worry is that when you talk about anti-fascist politics, when against Farage, when you talk about Republican fronts, when you say, look, what's got to happen at the next election is there has to be massive tactical voting. So if you're a Green or a Corbynista and you absolutely hate Labour Party, you've still got to vote for your sitting Labour MP to stop Farage. Likewise with a sitting Lib Dem, likewise with a sitting Green. You know, people have just got to bury their differences. Is there any indication that you were talking about the splintering on the right?
Mhm.
If you look at the splintering on the left, is there any indication that people are willing to do that? Or is it now that, frankly, if you're a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, you hate Keir Starmer far more than you hate Nigel Farage, and you want to vote against Starmer, not vote against Farage?
Yeah, one of my favorite ways of trying to get to the bottom of this is we do something called a negative voting intention, where instead of asking people who they would vote for in an election, we ask who they would vote against. And if you think that strategy would work, you would expect a lot of people to say they would vote against Reform UK in an election. Um, you want sort of negative polarization against Reform for that strategy to work. Actually, quite, but in most sort of groups in the country, people say they would vote against Labour. So
Right.
it's not necessarily reassuring for the Labour Party if you have a lot of people, including people sort of voting Green, Lib Dems, Independent, your party, whoever, who say they're actually more pissed off with Labour than they are worried about reform. That's a challenge. I think there's a big group of Lib Dem voters, and we saw that in the last election, who are really sort of tactical left bloc voters more than they are Lib Dem voters. And I think that hasn't changed. And I think actually this next election, I don't know, will be a nightmare as a pollster actually to model because you will get people in two blocks on the left and the right, basically tactically sorting according to where they live to try and stop the other block from winning. But you will also get, to add more complexity, the people within those blocks who would, on the left, for example, would never vote Labour, so will vote Liberal Democrat even if they have no chance of winning. And on the right, would never vote for the Conservatives, so will vote Reform, even if Reform has no chance of winning there. So that's all to say it's very hard to tell. But if I was the Labour Party, I would not be worried. I would not be sort of reassuring myself by the prospect of voters suddenly flocking back to Labour when they see when they see that Reform might win an election.
So what you're saying is large numbers of the public, large proportion of the public, dislike Keir Starmer more than they dislike Nigel Farage,
Yeah, exactly.
which is an argument for Labour Party to get rid of Starmer. Is it not?
Or it's just a sign of I'd say it's not that they dislike Keir Starmer, it's that they dislike the Labour Party now
Oh,
too.
okay. So it doesn't matter who the leader is.
Yeah, and there's groups in the country who would say on the left, like, we've just had enough of these two main parties. We need something different. The
Yeah.
same way that's driving people to reform, but on the left, it's I'm going to vote for the Greens or I'm going to vote for Jeremy Corbyn um because I'm clearly the status quo isn't working.
Yeah. Right. On that, I think it's a grim prospect because I think it makes the chances of Farage government more likely. But maybe, as you say, Ed, it is all horrendously complicated. We will try and navigate a way through those complications in the coming months and years. But for the meantime, Ed, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's been a great pleasure and an education. I need to just do a bit of housekeeping now. I need to say, if you like this podcast, please give us a nice rating on Apple or Spotify or whatever you're listening to it, whatever app you're listening to it on. It does help. It does help spread the word. So there are kind of Amazon and Apple rankings, and the more nice 5-star and nice reviews we get, the higher up we go. If you like my journalism, you can read me on Substack, Nick Cohen, writing from London. Google Nick Cohen Substack. You will get there. You can either be a free or a paying subscriber. It's dead simple. And loads of people are moving on to Substack now. It's kind of the future of journalism, I think. I need to think and thank. I need to think. I need to thank Andy Hoskins, not just think Andy Hoskins. I need to think and thank Andy Hoskins, our producer, who turns what would otherwise be utter shambles into the beautiful, seamless podcast you listened to today. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, I need to thank you for listening. And until next time, goodbye.